What are the industry experts doing that is different to ADP in your best ball leagues as things happen here in 2023 at this current moment in time, early June? Lots of stuff to discuss, Shawn. For long-time listeners of RotoViz Overtime, we did mention on Friday that was the 600th edition of the show. So as we continue here, people who are with us for a long time will know of the MFL10 of Death. This is number 10. It's been going on, obviously, for 10 years. Some of the biggest names in the industry are involved in this each and every single year. We have Pat Thorman. We have obviously our own Shawn Siegele here, Denny Carter, Sigmund Bloom, Mike Clay. We have JJ Zachariason, Rummy, Reeves, Evan Silva, Mike Beers, Scott Barrett. It's a loaded cast every single season. But what's always interesting, and usually, Shawn, we used to look at this and we wouldn't have Best Ball Mania 4 run at this point with lots of drafts ongoing. We wouldn't, and we'd be looking at this to see where are some of the industry leaders looking for certain players and what are the surprises versus where we might think ADP is heading for that season. But the interesting thing here is we have ADP kind of already established based on best ball season, this being a best ball league. We see some differences. We see some different structures. We see some different lineups, and it's going to be fun to run through some of the opening rounds of that today. Shawn, for some of the people who maybe aren't familiar with the MFL10 of Death as a seasoned player in it, I believe you've been in all 10 of these.
I have.
So you're well informed at this point. Share with the audience some of the key insights here.
This format is the old MFL 10 format, and it's an interesting kind of halfway point between.
It's interesting, Shawn, when you mentioned MFL 10 of Death format. I'm quite sure because of the explosion of best ball, there's a lot of people probably wondering, what's MFL 10? I remember crushing in those pre-week one drafts to try and get your allocation up to see what you could win that season back in the day.
Yeah. And so obviously fantasy has exploded, best ball has exploded. And anyone who has come to it very recently is going to not have played in as many of these. But this was the original big best ball format. And we do have the fan ball, which at a certain point in time purchased the MFL 10s. We have those tools up on the site. Mike Beers, who is in this league, obviously put together our tool suite. And now we have Dave and Blair and Anthony building onto those. But the cool thing about this is that this is sort of a halfway in between format from the FFPC Best Ball leagues that you and I are going to be competing in with the listeners over the next coming weekends. Colm, you have set up a Superflex League draft for us this coming weekend. The $125 full tournament league will be the following weekend. We're really looking forward to those. Obviously, we're also drafting in Underdog, and Peter Overset and I are doing that live on Wednesdays. You also have the audio feed here on the RotoViz radio channel. If you could, please subscribe to that. That really helps us. But Colm, the FFPC is 2 running back, 2 wide receiver, and 2 flex. Underdog is 2 running back, 3 wide receiver, and 1 flex. And as Connor O'Driscoll has pointed out on the site, and I had an article that came out on Friday. We're going to talk about it more on the Wednesday show, sort of an elite QB, hyper-fragile approach to winning Underdog. But one of the interesting points there is that Underdog, even with the half PPR format, because it's a 2-3-1 format, the best that you can do at running back would be to have 3 guys in your starting lineup. And so there's a limit to how you can really hit on them. Now, with the ADP of 2023, FFPC, you could almost argue, is a 4 running back, 2 wide receiver optimal starting lineup. That's probably not really that, but there's an argument to be made in that direction. One of the things with MFL 10 of Death is that even as we move to more wide receiver heavy, and certainly as the market gives you a strong nudge in the direction of getting those wide receivers, this is more of a 2 running back, 4 wide receiver format, because the necessity to build out the 3 wide receivers and then how the scoring works for the flex pushes it in that direction. With Underdog, we have more of a 2.5, 3.5 starting lineup when we're looking at running back versus wide receiver. So these 3 formats, I think, are interesting in the nuance. And when you're playing through those, you're working through your draft strategy. I really enjoy those small differences and how they can actually manifest in a pretty big way once you put your whole draft together. But Colm, one of the interesting things that we saw in this draft, which again is sort of a one-off draft with the industry experts, as you mentioned, is that the running back versus wide receiver ADP tracked Underdog ADP almost exactly.
It did, and that's really up until round 4, and that's kind of an area we're going to focus on today. So round 4 turn at the 412, we have 25 wide receivers going off the board at that particular point, and 16 running backs going off the board through that 4th round. Very, very similar to what we're seeing in Underdog at the moment. But the big change, Shawn, from what we're seeing in Underdog drafting, and I think it's been interesting. I thought this would have tailed off a little bit quicker than it has, and I think what we're going to see is when people who follow the likes of Pat, might read some of your reports that you write on this league, or Denny or Mike or Lord Reeves, for example, if it's coming out with this draft board that the quarterbacks are sliding a little bit later. We have seen them fall a little bit over the last week, but they're still in that 2-3 turn range and starting to slide back in. But the big difference in this, Shawn, is the quarterbacks, 2 quarterbacks in round 3, none before that, 1 quarterback in round 4, 2 quarterbacks in round 5, and then we get 1 quarterback in round 6. So 1 quarterback in round 7, 1 quarterback in round 8. So through round 8 quarterbacks gone. So we're seeing a big difference in, I guess, the utilization of your draft resources and quarterback in this particular format.
And it's interesting to have Josh Allen as that second QB sort of in the late middle of the 3rd round. He's a guy who in my Underdog drafts in the last week has been sliding into the 3rd round. So Jalen Hurts, someone who with the 2 receivers, each of whom you can pair him with and with the hybrid abilities, I mean, he's probably the most solid guy in terms of giving you both floor and ceiling and a lot of different ways to get to those points. One of the things that we're looking at is that Patrick Mahomes, the best quarterback in the NFL, the best passer in the NFL, probably a reasonably high floor still. And we know that in a dream season, he's got a high ceiling, but it really is one path. Now, it's a path that we feel very confident that he is going to take. And yet Hurts a player who can get there in a lot of different ways. And unlike Mahomes, who has an aging star and then a lot of question marks. Now, the question marks are exciting. When you look at Kadarius Toney, Sky Moore, Rashee Rice, and Justin Ross, I mean, if you get 2 of those 4 guys to break out, then suddenly you have an unstoppable juggernaut. So there are reasons to be enthusiastic. And yet I thought it was surprising that Hurts fell here. I passed on QB at the 211. I passed on QB at the 302. I do think that those are somewhat interesting picks. Again, that show that we're going to do on Wednesday is going to talk about Elite QB with Hyperfragile. And yet, as I work through a lot of the different elements of 2023, I am moving in the direction of thinking you probably don't want to spend that much at quarterback. The other interesting thing that we're going to track over the next month is that if you look at 2022 ADP at the QB position, when the big tournaments released, you had the early drafts, you were coming off of a season in which Elite QB did pretty well. The quarterbacks in May were expensive, but by the time that we got to June, the prices had dropped, and they didn't drop a ton more the rest of the way, except for Mahomes, which again is interesting in light of the fact that he was one of the players who hit in a very big way. So his price, you would argue, shouldn't have dropped. We'll see the direction that these guys take. We'll see what the eventual landing spot of DeAndre Hopkins does for an Allen or a Mahomes or a Deshaun Watson. But the QB pricing in this league and just in general, I think even with the new Elite QB era that we are in, you still tend to see these guys go a little bit later in expert formats than high stakes formats. We saw it again here, and I do think the experts are on the right track in this case.
The other thing, Shawn, that's interesting in this, and we have seen this in the past, shaking up ADP a little bit, but we have 5 of the 12 teams starting wide receiver in this. Then there is 3 teams with 4 wide receivers through 5 rounds. But we do see a huge variety of builds throughout this in terms of the overall structures. You go wide or running back a little bit early, and we're going to go into your team in a moment to look through it kind of a little bit more depth. But based on the strategy and the scoring and so on that you mentioned earlier, were you surprised to have 5 teams out of the 12 go running back, or go wide receiver, or was that something that you were kind of expecting based on what we're seeing with, I guess, the wide receiver avalanches in 2023?
Right. The avalanche can really get you. So I don't think it's surprising at all. And if anything, I think it's a little bit surprising that we didn't get maybe one more team go that route. But one of the things that drafters are having to deal with right now, and this is something that Pete and I had to deal with last Wednesday, is that once you hit T. Higgins at wide receiver 15, there's a massive tier break. And so I think that Pat Thorman with the 101 would have also liked to have gone receiver. He has Justin Jefferson to start, but at the turn, he takes Josh Jacobs and Nick Chubb. Both of those picks I think are fantastic. I took Breece Hall at the 302, and then the next couple picks, Patrick Mahomes and Mark Andrews. Mike Clay, who went for a very running back and onesie heavy start, selects Amari Cooper at wide receiver 16. They're in the middle of the 3rd round, and the next couple of guys who are selected are Keenan Allen and Deebo Samuel. Allen's somebody who we have well above ADP, so that pick, I think, fits exactly with where our rankings are. Deebo Samuel, a little bit of a tricky guy, but certainly when you get him late in the 3rd, you're happy about that. What I think it illustrates here is that, that tier break is not just a tier break. You fall off a cliff. And so even though you know that you need to get, say, 5 wide receivers in the first 7 rounds, that's one of the real goals in almost any of these drafts. Round 3 is probably a running back round. We see it again here. Amari Cooper at wide receiver 16. I'd be surprised if he finishes in the top 30. Now, a little bit of that is still the belief that coming off of the relatively poor final season in Dallas and then last year where there's no target competition, he actually performs extremely well with Jacoby Brissett, but they make that QB change to Deshaun Watson. There's no rapport there. He finishes on a skid, and it's easy to say, well, a lot of that is just due to the fact that Watson wasn't ready to play. You have the shakeup. You don't really want to be in a situation late in the year like that where you're making the QB change and the guy hasn't played much and you haven't practiced, all of that kind of thing. And yet the other thing that we do tend to see in cases like this is that the full season gives you the better picture. Anyway, Amari Cooper, we probably have a little bit of an overly enthusiastic belief about what he did last year because he was so hot in the first 2/3. His overall season really still solid, but not great. Now you have a team where Elijah Moore has come in. I wouldn't be surprised if Elijah Moore is the number 1 on that particular team. The buzz in OTAs has been enthusiastic. Obviously, you're going to get some puff pieces. You want to both track what's going on and also not get too up or down on the guys based on these puff pieces, but also the potential for DeAndre Hopkins to be there. Amari Cooper could easily be the number 3 target in this offense in 2023. Now, that's not likely, but it's a very realistic scenario that should be priced in. So, again, when we're going into Amari Cooper, Keenan Allen, somebody that drafters at Underdog have in the 4th round, Deebo, someone where you can get Brandon Ayuk later. This is really the big question for this time of the 2023 campaign is how do you approach the 3rd round? And Colm, unfortunately for us, we do have some running backs we like in that range.
Yeah, very much. So we talked about, for anyone that didn't hear Friday's show, we did talk through Blair's article up on the website, looking at his favorite picks through each of the opening rounds over at Underdog in terms of the ADP at the moment. And one of the things, Shawn, we did talk about, and you've kind of touched on it there, is that zone, particularly from Higgins, depending if he goes off the board, usually in the 2nd round, could be the 3rd round, but there is running backs there that are very much of interest. You do take Breece Hall in this, obviously somebody who's a kind of priority target, but Ramondre Stevenson's there. There is some other questionable running back names, but there is a kind of a tier there for running backs. But we talked about potentially trying to get 3 of the round 4 guys between rounds 3, 4, and 5. So taking one of them early, getting another one. And I feel like this is another example of it based on the kind of veteran tier that may be aging out. There may still be potential for those guys to hit in 2023 and even possibly beyond. But I do think that we're looking at some of those guys potentially hitting age cliffs here where things could get very tough very quickly. And you mentioned Amari Cooper, he could be one of those guys. When we look at your team, Shawn, I guess to dive into it a little bit, starts with Jamar Chase at the wide receiver 2 overall, your second pick. You picked from the 102 spot. Then we get T. Higgins, Breece Hall, Chris Godwin, JSN, George Pickens, DeAndre Swift, James Cook, Javonte Williams. That is through 9 rounds. So we're sitting at 5 wide receivers, 4 running backs. You mentioned, the goal of having 5 wide receivers through 7 rounds. You had those 5 wide receivers through 6 rounds. Before I dish out my thoughts on the team, I guess I'll say, how are you feeling so far through 9 rounds of it?
I like it. And I mean, again, one of the things we talk a lot about on the show is that you should like your team because you should be prepared for the draft.
Ideally, you should like it.
Yeah, and then you should be drafting players that you want to root for and you have enthusiasm for. So as you go through these drafts, don't let yourself get caught up in trying to hit other objectives that are more peripheral to that and get to the end and feel like you don't like it. Now, I say that it is important to experiment even at the BBM4 level where you're thinking, well, you don't have an infinite number of entries, although you do get a lot, and you don't want to blow it at a $25 level because those $25 add up. We're still doing some experimentation. So it's not like everything is rote or you're only going after your guys every single draft, but you do want to enjoy these. So one of the things that was really sticking out to me, and some listeners of the show, and then certainly some non-listeners of the show, people who maybe don't buy into the RotoViz philosophy as strongly, are going to say, well, but yeah, I mean, there are reasons you're getting these guys. But if you would have told me a couple of years ago that you could go 5 wide receivers in the first 6 rounds and your running back group would be Breece Hall, DeAndre Swift, James Cook, and Javonte Williams, you would just say, no way. I mean, there's no way that you could get those guys. I mean, DeAndre Swift in the 7th round. So there is some injury risk with Hall and Williams. This is a full year type of league. And so it's not a case where you're kind of hoping to get through and then beat a huge tournament in the playoffs. You're trying to beat these 11 guys. And if my running backs don't score early, that'll be an issue. And so you want to be aware of what the red flags are, what the hurdles are, why you would be able to get these players. But for me, the amount of talent that is represented by that group is frankly pretty absurd. And so I'm excited about it. And we'll see how the summer continues to develop. There is the potential for bad news on Hall and Williams to move these guys down another round and a half. And yet
there's potential for that, Shawn, but any reports that have come out over the last 2 weeks and around camp, you're always going to have, you mentioned some puff pieces, some buzz being spread out there, but in 2023, we're able to see these guys, operating via camera footage and, for where they are in their recovery at this point in June, it looks a lot more positive than maybe we would have thought, 4 to 6 weeks ago that it would be at this stage.
Yeah, and it seems like Hall will be ready. And Colm, if Breece Hall hadn't gotten hurt, which again he did, but if he hadn't, he's
probably where Austin Eckler goes in this draft, which is the running back 1.
So the 105 overall.
Yeah, probably in that range. I think he's right up there, and he's definitely in the conversation for first running back drafted. I think, is that too aggressive?
I don't think so. What we saw from him would be the type of profile that could actually push Travis Kelce in this, 103, could push a Tyreek Hill. I don't think that in the new era that really any running back, I mean, if you have a peak Christian McCaffrey in the perfect offense, then I think he still would be the 101. Otherwise, it's going to be hard to really push Justin Jefferson and Jamar Chase. The wide receivers are so valuable, and those guys are so good. But Breece Hall, healthy, I mean, he's a more explosive version of Le'Veon Bell and David Johnson, which, as we know, I mean, those were the guys who really ushered in the age of the Uber back. When running backs were winning fantasy leagues for folks, you had those guys. You had Todd Gurley. Behind them, you get Ezekiel Elliott and Christian McCaffrey. We're going to get some of those guys again. And it may not be this year. It may be 2024. And be like, I mean, Shawn, there's no point to drafting a good 2024 roster. That's not the goal. But when you look at names like Breece Hall and Javonte Williams, I mean, those are the types of talents who, if we're back to running back heavy drafting a year from now, which Colm, frankly, I don't think is that unlikely. It's not the most likely scenario, but it's very possible that there's a big shift again at this point next year. Some of the culprits could be Hall and Williams.
Yeah, I definitely think and again, you mentioned Williams. He's the running back 31 in this draft. That is your pick in the 9th round. I just think there's room for a lot of things to change here. Even the likes of DeAndre Swift, running back 22, going to Philadelphia, there can be challenges, obviously playing with Jalen Hurts, but there's no doubt there's a lot of positives if he is, the lead. I don't even know if he has to necessarily be getting every carry. The problem was last year he was getting, kind of some of the lower value touches and breaking off 60-yard runs and getting tackled inside the 5-yard line. I think things could also open up a lot for him. James Cook, the other part, I guess, of your team, Shawn, that I really liked when I seen it first is these are all running backs in what we expect to be pretty high-powered offenses heading into 2023, and you're also getting them at discounts. It's not going to be very often, I don't think, that you get all 3 of those guys in round 7, round 8, and round 9 in drafts. That's going to be a challenge to do, and there is other running backs going in those 3 rounds that we are not interested in. But those 3 guys in particular, if you're springing forward 12 months and these guys are going in round 2, 3, and 4, I'm not going to be one that. Again, like you said, if somebody had told you 4 years ago this is the team you could draft, you would have been surprised. I'm not going to be overly surprised if those guys are bouncing back up next year, because the concern around Williams is the injury, and the concern then, even if we go back to Breece Hall, is the injury. There's no other reason outside of injury for Breece Hall to be where he is in the 3rd round. And I'm guessing as this footage comes out and the reports come out over the next, let's say, 2 months, I think we might see him edge up into the Jonathan Taylor side of things here, where he's mid-2nd round pick.
And we want to be very aware of the way the injuries work, and that you have this potential for the player to not truly be himself. You and I, certainly on Stealing Bananas with Ben, our shows and our content is more focused on talent than most other places. That's not to say that other fantasy sites and other fantasy managers don't want to draft talented players. They definitely do. But if we're focused on talent and the guy isn't himself, then that's not really who you're drafting. So you have to be aware of that. You also have to be aware that with all of these running backs, you have the potential for re-injury. One of the questions as well would be, DeAndre Swift, you think about that first game and a half last year, if he doesn't get hurt, where is he going? This is a guy who I get in the early 7th, his ADP in Underdog, again, right there. If he doesn't have those injuries last season, you're talking about him as Austin Eckler. You're talking about him as a 1-2 turn kind of pick. But with DeAndre Swift, we have a really long track record of him not being able to stay healthy. We don't expect him to get through it. We don't expect him to be able to handle a heavy workload. But that's one of the reasons why the Philadelphia landing spot is so important, because that's a team where, especially in best ball, and you don't have to guess when those points are going to come, he's going to be able to score a lot on a relatively limited workload. The other thing that I just like to mention here is that with Swift, I either want Swift or Penny on almost every team, because it's going to be really difficult. Now, it's possible. It may turn out that Kenneth Gainwell is the guy that you want, because both of these guys get hurt. We know they have trouble staying healthy. But from a more optimistic perspective, I want either Swift or Penny on every team. The same thing is true with Javonte Williams, where Samaje Perine in the Underdog draft I did last night, he went ahead of Javonte Williams. I want one of those 2 guys on almost every team. So the offense is there, as you mentioned, Colm. That's a big part of it. We think that the contingency-based element of the scoring for these backs favors both of them, and the prices in this case on both guys are fantastic. So good, in fact, that I think that you can actually draft them together and not have it be a handcuff or a conservative type of play, but really just simply drafting 2 guys who are going to score a lot of points. So I'm not urging people to do that, but if you get in the right spot in your draft, you already have one, and the other guy is just the screaming value. Don't ignore the possibility of simply taking both. Colm, looking at these other picks then, start Chase, Higgins, Breece Hall, then Chris Godwin, JSN, Pickens, Swift, Cook, Williams. Looking at that 4, 5, 6 range, where it's Godwin, JSN, Pickens, what would you have done differently there? And again, to give a little bit of a feel, The two guys who went off the board right before Godwin were Jerry Jeudy and Drake London. Obviously, we're hoping that Jeudy makes it to that spot. At the turn then in between are Christian Kirk and Marquise Brown. I think those are good picks for Pat, but they're not guys I was targeting. I take JSN, and the next two picks later on in that round, or next three, I should say, giving a little feel for round 5, are DJ Moore, Mike Williams, and Michael Pittman. All three of those guys arguably have big names, but also some huge problems for 2023. And then as it comes back, round 6 was a little bit frustrating. The middle of the round, that is Ayuk. Treylon Burks goes 2 picks ahead of me. That was the target that I had. Then Jordan Addison, I picked Pickens. And I'm not going to give spoilers on the guys at the turn who were both targets. Colm, how would you have navigated this?
I think you've navigated it in very much the same way. I think your thought process is when you're in round 4 and you're waiting for that pick where you eventually did Chris Godwin, I think you're saying, please, Jerry Jeudy, just get to me. I think that's probably the thought process there. And then when it is got like the goal, the ideal selection at that turn would have been to get Jeudy at your 4th pick and then at your 5th pick to get Chris Godwin. I think if you were picking your pick by pick ideal draft for where things have, I think you pretty much have what you would have picked heading into this draft, but I think that's what you would have, if you could have said the perfect scenario would be to have Jeudy and Godwin versus Godwin and JSN. I could be wrong on that, but that would be where I'd be saying. So when it gets to Godwin there, I think he's clearly the pick I would make at that point. And then the discussion point is probably the JSN one, which is interesting. TJ Hawkinson goes 3 picks later. It's Aaron Jones, Lamar Jackson, TJ Hawkinson. Hawkinson could be potentially interesting there for, to lock up that tight end position. And we won't spoil who the player was that you were talking about in round 7 at the turn, Shawn, but it's another tight end. I'm sure listeners will be able to put that piece of the jigsaw together for themselves. So I think Hawkinson could have been interesting there at the JSN spot. You mentioned then, and a bit like we talked about in round 3, once you go past T. Higgins, you get into like a veteran tier of wide receivers where there is some question marks. And you mentioned there DJ Moore, who has been one of our favorites for many years. You get Mike Williams, you get Michael Pittman. I think, there's question marks as to how quick the quarterback situation there is, the upgrade. But the way he has had to play with, Matt Ryan, for example, last season, there's no doubt anyone throwing on the ball, I think, is going to help him this year. So he is a potentially interesting option there. But I think I might have, if I was going to change it, may have gone Hawkinson there. The other one is, we talked about this last week as well with Jahan Dotson. Love Dotson, like Pickens as well. I think I'm more in on Dotson, but again, playing the ADP game, you're usually going to get Dotson a couple of picks later, and he might have lasted at that turn, but he doesn't back to you at the 7:02. So I think overall it's the same way I would have played it. The way I've talked through it there, Shawn, is that kind of some of the thought process. Did Dotson, for example, come into consideration at that Pickens pick? Would this ideal situation here be to be Jerry Jeudy and Chris Godwin? And then the part about Hawkinson, was there any thought in moving him in there in the 5:02?
Hawkinson is tricky for me in this campaign, where one of the things that I do try and force myself to do, we talk a lot about optimism. We talk about understanding what the scenarios are and that you're pricing all of them as opposed to just the most likely one, and that good prices on some of the less likely scenarios, if those scenarios are league winning, you want to be very aware of them. We also talk a little bit about not chasing your favorite guys up the board. That happens with zero RB, where you hit on guys in that round 10 range. Occasionally you hit on guys in the 15, 16 range, and they're the next season in rounds 2 and 3. And you've got to really force yourself to then answer the question, well, can this guy now be a top 5 overall player? Because if I'm going to draft him in rounds 2 or 3, that's where I need him to hit if he's a running back. We can't simply take a guy who had a good season for us because we like him. Hawkinson is a player I'm trying not to chase because there's also that track record of him being not just a guy, but not being in this top group. And one of the elements here that I do have a little trouble with, I've had people ask me, why do you have JSN so high? We will kind of go through that as the offseason progresses. For me, there's a huge gap between him and those next 3 guys who are drafted right behind him. And so The Seahawks, certainly you would argue, got a great deal. Now, we do really like Addison and really like Quentin Johnston, which gives you a sense of how much we like JSN if there's, again, a big tier break. But Addison I have more trouble with when you have Justin Jefferson there as a superstar who is going to be 1,500 yards that you could just put in the bank, and that's not going to go to the other receivers. You have Hawkinson there as a target hog. But I think with both of those guys in play behind Jefferson, that you then have to argue that KJ Osborne is not going to get much of anything. The running backs are not going to get a lot. It's not going to be an offense that kind of evolves in the direction of Alexander Madison and the understudies emerging to take a big portion of the offense. If you're going to value Hawkinson and Addison at these prices, they have to really concentrate what's left of the offense behind Jefferson. Now, in many ways, that's probably the most likely scenario, but it's the only scenario where you're going to get these guys to pay off other than injury. Now, I mean, injury is also somewhat likely, but you have ceiling prices that you're paying, I think. And so from that perspective, it's a little bit worrying. Now, it's arguably a ceiling price that we're paying on JSN as well. But for him, the ceiling, I think, is a season like we've gotten from Jefferson or we've gotten from Chase. And so I guess the argument would simply be that at wide receiver 29, you still have quite a bit of room to outperform that. So that would be the case there with Hawkinson. And why, I mean, I'm still drafting him. Pete and I drafted him last week. You and I have drafted him. And yet I'm trying to keep that exposure reasonable because I do think that it's a little bit of a chase element on him where we really are chasing a couple of those big games from last season. It just in terms of what ADP is in general. I mean, usually when you and I are taking him, it's at a good ADP or it's below ADP. You look here and it was exactly the issue that I was going through. As I was trying to decide whether or not to take Pickens and how to play it, I'm thinking, okay, my targets here are Pickens, Dotson, and Pitts. How can I get 2 out of the 3? I only got 1 out of the 3. Now, the consolation is that
the good news is there, Shawn, no matter how you played it, unless you skipped on Pickens and he skipped them, there was no way to get 2 out of the 3.
That's true. That's true. And the consolation was that the once I worked through it and I got over the fact that I wasn't necessarily planning to take a running back there, Swift actually was the 4th guy. So I had 4 guys. You get 2 of them. You're very happy. After Swift, I really dislike the entire rest of the 7th round. You have David Montgomery, Cam Akers, Brandon Cooks, Gabe Davis. You do kind of like Dallas Goedert there in the mid-7. Anthony Richardson, Darren Waller, James Conner, Quentin Johnston, and Isaiah Pacheco. Colm, those guys could score. You can understand their prices, but it is something where if you have the 2nd overall pick, there are going to be some downsides in that you're maybe not going to be able to get as many values. You're not going to be able to control the board. You might have to pick somebody early, like I did it with JSN. If you think that he's the guy, you're not going to necessarily get as good a price. And yet there is the value of having the early pick. You get that early pick in 7, depending on how the board is set up. You may be the last drafter to get someone before the value completely collapses. So I'm grateful for having that 2nd pick because I do think that there's a tier break after Swift.
Yeah, there's a couple of, and we mentioned obviously with the Breece Hall pick as well. I think there's a couple of tier breaks that you just managed to miss out on. So pretty nice team through those opening 9 rounds. There is 20 rounds in this. So maybe on a show next week, we might follow up to see how the back half of the draft goes out and how Shawn feels about how things settle up in this one. But we will be back on Wednesday with another show. As always, if you are interested in signing up over at rotoviz.com to get access to all the content and tools over there, including Shawn's work, you can use the code RVRadio2023 at checkout to save yourself 10% off a 1-year RotoViz pass. Already looking forward, Shawn, to those drafts that we will be having this weekend against some of the listeners. Those will come out as feature podcasts over the next couple of weeks, so you'll get our thoughts while we are on the clock in those ones. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on Twitter at @OverToMarlin. My co-host, as always, is Shawn Siegele. Check out all of his work up on rotoviz.com. And until we are back, have a good one.